Well, Lydia asked a very sophisticated question. I'm, in a journalistic fashion, going to dumb it down. Are we seeing a run-up to a new Cold War?
I think it depends on what we do, and this was asked in the last presidential debate, and John McCain's answer was exactly what I think. It really depends on what we do from here on out. I think the goal needs to be to avoid that, and I think Steve talked about that in his response as well. We have to have a situation where we engage the Russians. They are not an enemy. But we have to also look into the Russians' eyes and know exactly what they're up to. You have to be able to engage someone, you need to understand what their motives are. You need to understand them completely, but you also have to understand what your bottom line is. We have to do our best to engage the Russians to help persuade them to change their behavior. That what they did in Georgia was yes, a very long history going back 20 years of trying to constantly erase Georgia's ability to be a viable independent country since before the fall of the Soviet Union. And we have to understand that we can't just sort of give in to these things. We have to stand by our friends, and we have to stand by making sure that these kinds of actions like what we saw in Georgia are opposed. And I'm very glad that Russia stands completely alone in the world today, diplomatically, over what it did in Georgia, and that's a very hopeful sign.
I agree that the idea of drawing a line and standing firm on your convictions is important. I agree that the idea of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO is a positive development for their security and for Western security. I'm not necessarily sure that I agree with the rhetoric of being belligerent towards Russia rather than trying to lessen these tensions. And I think there's a critical difference in the language that we use. I think rhetoric is important, and the language that we use going into any of these situations is critical. When John McCain instantaneously said the moment that the fighting broke out that we're all Georgians now, I think oversimplifies the situation. We support our allies. We wish to be helpful. I'm not necessarily sure if the facts bear themselves out that what actually sparked this was a Georgian attack on Russian troops. It doesn't justify their reaction. But if we determine this, then saying that we're all Georgians, well, we wouldn't all support the idea that the Georgians would be provocative in that particular way.
15 seconds, yeah.
Do it.
Actually, the Georgian action on the Russian occupiers of two of their provinces was something that was about 15 years in coming, and it was set up by the Russians from the beginning. They inserted themselves into that country. They gave Russian passports to the residents of those two provinces over the course of the recent year as a clearly provocative act to say, we're going to annex this territory, come and get us. So for this weak neighbor to try and assert control over its sovereign territory to be seen as the reason why all of this happened. It did happen. I actually believe that the Georgians did attack, and I frankly think that they were right in doing so. And I think they had actually no other choice, because the Russians were doing everything they could to change the conditions on the ground so that they could never reclaim this territory that is theirs. But the important thing I think that John McCain laid out is that there are some times where you have to call a spade and say, this is wrong. This regime is a regime that murders its opponents here and abroad. This is a regime that is manipulating the facts, that is doing something illegal here, and we have to stand against it. I'm glad that the entire world stood with the United States on that position.
Steve, final word on that?
I'm just not sure that we should be in a position of supporting that level of military force. Look, by saying that that the Georgians were right in using military force in that, provoked that Russian response, which caused an enormous amount of death, destruction, and upheaval in that country.
It was inevitable.
Well, I think we'll need to part company on its inevitability. There may have been other ways. The OSCE has been working in that region with a mission for a long time, trying to lessen tensions and come to some new resolution there. Whether or not they would have ultimately been successful, that's not clear. But I'm not sure that we're all Georgians in the sense that we all supported what actually happened with that level of upheaval and violence, death and destruction. I'm not sure that was the right solution to support that we would want to support the Georgians in saying, Military action is what's called for at this moment in time.
Just a little more kerosene on the fire here. This is a compelling scenario that both of you lay out. I mean, are we creeping towards a Cold War then? If the Ukraine is next, if the Georgian situation flares up again and others, I mean, or is Russia too feeble a country to be worried about in that sense?
They're definitely not too feeble a country, and they've definitely, with their new petroleum wealth over the last number of years, clearly been reasserting themselves. There was a period of time when their economy was quite weak, and they seemed like a debilitated power, but they're back on the rise again. Whether or not we are looking at the possibility of a chilling of relationships that would lead to a Cold War, I don't think that we're headed in that direction. But we need to be very clear about where we stand in relationship to Russia, to the region, and the kinds of actions, and I think this goes back to what I was saying a moment ago, the kinds of actions we support by making these statements about the Georgians were right to launch a military attack that provoked this, I think only serves to push the Russians further away from us and further away from the community of civilized nations and into some corner whose results we may not be happy about.
I've been to Georgia. I've been to Gori, which was the city in the center of the country that was flattened by Russian bombers. There were actually bombed apartment buildings. I've been to Tbilisi. I talked to the people there. They love this. They love the United States, not for any reason other than what it represents. And they wanted to build that kind of a society in their country. And they can't do it with the huge foot of the Russian Empire on their heads. They weren't able to do it in the Soviet Union, and the history of Georgia's membership in the Soviet Union showed that the Russians did everything they could to eliminate their language, their cultural identity in every way, because they'd always been afraid of Georgia's ability to be a viable country free of Russia's control. If we were to treat a Latin American country the same way, and I can't imagine that anyone could justify morally saying the people of that country had no right to fight back. And if we had pushed a country so far into a corner where the very viability of their government was at stake, and they had begun to acquire huge swaths of land, making it very clear they were never going to leave, I mean, at that point, you're against the wall. The problem, I think, is I think that Vladimir Putin is testing us. So the question about the Cold War, it has a lot to do with what we do now and what he thinks he can do in response. That's really the test. This is not a society that can be leveraged from the ground up. This is a society run by one man, and it has a lot to do with what he's going to do and what we do.